Hey there, hunters. Welcome back to the Monster Hunter History Channel, or the Gunners Guild, as it's known sometimes, but Monster Hunter History Channel. When we look into the design of Monster Hunter, there's some very interesting concepts that you can see throughout it. Guns that look like fish, bugs that look like tanks, and of course, a dragon that just looks like a horse. What? It's a perfectly reasonable thing for Monster Hunter players to hear.
The Elder Dragon classification has always been known as a sort of dumping ground for things that don't really fit into any other category like wyverns or leviathans, and it's been this way ever since the very first game. The Elder Dragon Kirin, the subject of today's video, is one such monster, a bright white horse with a horn on its head that somehow got in with the same crowd as Fatalis and Teostra. I do wish there was some other word we could use to describe a creature like that, but anyways, I digress. Kirin's been a bit of an oddball in the sense that whilst we've seen monsters similar to the other elders in the series, we really haven't seen an elder like Kirin.
Not only that, but for its first few iterations, we really didn't see any change to it either. Kirin had a very basic moveset and a very hectic movement pattern. Even half the animations were lifted straight up from a Kelby. But due to its smaller size, rare thunder element, and unique body shape, it became pretty iconic amongst its dragon brethren. But today we're going to be discussing where the real meat comes from when we take a 4th generation horse and slap it into the next gen, and how Monster Hunter World's Kirin turned its predecessors into glue by comparison. Kirin was seriously improved and evolved, and it's one of the more unique monsters to do so. So let's get started with 4th gen.
Before we begin, we'd like to point out that there are basically no Kirin quests in Monster Hunter 4 Ultimate. Crazy, right? There's guild quests you can randomly find for it, and only 2 event quests. One with double Kirin and Oroshi, and another alongside Zinnoga and Rajang. But no just Kirin quests. No village, no guild, nothing. I mean, village does have a one-time introduction quest for Kirin in the story, but it's not repeatable. With limited access to event quests on Citra, we really weren't able to get full Kirin footage aside from the cutscene. Blame Nintendo or something, someone's gotta pay. With that out of the way though, let's continue.
4th gen Kirin is probably the Kirin most people are familiar with, and definitely has its frustrations. Matchup wise, there's only a few small set of weapons that could effectively deal with Kirin, first being the Grape Sword, a weapon that required extremely precise positioning to use in the old versions of games. Heavy Bowgun because it's Heavy Bowgun, Bow because it was effectively a longer ranged greatsword back then, and of course Charge Blade since it could guard point and retaliate with AED slaps. Most other weapons had a much rougher time dealing with it, and what really didn't help was that when Kirin was enraged and charged up, the aura would make even purple sharpness weapons bounce off its diamond hide unless you were hitting the face, which made large sized Kirins especially painful, and of course it really only relegated you to taking it on face to face. So what else made Kirin such a nuisance in 4th gen? Owing to not changing much throughout the years, its attacks were very annoying to deal with. Most of the time, Kirin literally would just charge and gallop far past the hunter, which left little to no room to be able to retaliate against it. Greatsword and Charge Blade were the exceptions, as Greatsword could ready a charge where Kirin would end up, if you were skilled at least, and Charge Blade could just guard point the charge or gallop and then turn around to drop an AED on Kirin's horns.
Notice a trend. Both weapons front-load their damage into a single powerful strike, and the same could be said of Hammer, depending on the size RNG of course. Bows and bowguns could just get out of the way, and since they're ranged, they could turn around and shoot Kirin. Some accuracy required of course back then. This was half of Kirin's moveset, and yeah, as I mentioned, it's just annoying. The remaining moves of Rapidash here didn't really help the other weapons out. 4th gen introduced the turning headbutt that he'd do about 2 to 3 times, and whilst it's not the most dangerous of attacks, it rotates his body so much that the area of effect can be deceiving, and it's pretty hard for weapons to get a hit on its head before it started the next attack.
One of the most common patterns were lightning AoEs that would drop bolts around it, and in older generations of Kirins, it did not have a lot of time between the indicator of where the bolts would strike and them actually striking. Now it really didn't help that this multi-strike move would end in the final bolt tracking to wherever the player was, halfway through the taunt too, making this attack incredibly difficult to punish. Of course, Kirin had his big AoE lightning slam, and this was one of the only attacks that actually was readily punishable, as Kirin would always have a taunt at the end, giving the players the opportunity to strike back from the flank. Outside of that, the only other attack that Kirin had was his hind leg kick if you were behind him, and well, you don't really need to worry about that, it doesn't go very far. Kirin in 4th gen was a very simple fight. It required much more positioning and preemptive gameplay, knowing where it would end up and how to deal with it, more than a reactive gameplay like other monsters that you need to be able to avoid an attack and be able to attack back right away. A lot of people say the best way to learn monsters is like treating it like a turn-based game. You move, it moves, and just you learn how to dodge attacks that way. Kirin is not like that at all. It's more like being a counter boxer. You need to know where its attack is going and then meet it head on before it hits you.
Kirin's fighting style could almost be described as passive. For every move that is aimed at you, there seems to be two that are just sort of aimed around the thing. It's different, and I believe that's why a lot of players dislike the Kirin fight in other gens. But then along came 5th gen with Monster Hunter World. Not only did Kirin grow up a bit like most world monsters, it's a lot bigger than other games, but maybe that's a perspective thing. Kirin's fight also did get a redesign for 5th gen. Now, Kirin doesn't really charge and trot past the players nearly as much. Of course, sometimes it will, but again it's scarce by comparison, and it's more common that it just stops behind you rather than in the next continent. Now, Kirin likes to stay still and really bring down the thunder.
While Kirin has a lot of the same moves as before, that's not saying much because it only had like 5 attacks. But now it has gained multiple new lightning strikes, and what's cool about this is they all have very specific patterns. Kirin has lightnings that drop right in front of it, on the player with this very specific taunt, and an AoE around it, and a big horn slam in front of it, and of course the infamous lightning lines that can crisscross along the grounds in Master Rank. Kirin in 5th gen played a lot more like a bullet hell than any other monster. Also, all the different lightning strikes had very distinct audible and visual cues as to which ones it was gonna be, so it was up to the player to learn and distinguish these attacks to avoid getting zapped.
This required knowledge paid off for the hunters extremely well, as Kirin now had taunts after almost every other attack, where it would sort of shake its head and stand still for a moment, which gave players the opportunity to strike. Pairing this with the fact that it no longer dashed and galloped all over the place, and it made Kirin much more stationary, probably one of the most stationary fights in the game to be honest. But what this did do is allowed weapons with more even or backloaded combos to start catching up. Additionally, the horse, like other Elder Dragons, also had a head topple after 2 head staggers, and with relatively low thresholds to boot, it was fairly easy to knock down and get into your combos. So when you started to adapt to its fighting style, you get way more of a payoff for it.
And if that wasn't enough, Capcom also gave Kirin's head a nice magnet hit zone. And if you're playing a hunting horn or hammer, you know exactly what that means. Kirin's head hitbox was so big and so prioritized that bigger weapons could just attack from its back or in its middle of its body and go just to the direction of the head, and it's still gonna land on the head every time. It's not gonna hit the butt, not the body, nothing. So now the visual hitbox of where the weapon actually lands matches up way better now and makes them just hit the head all the time. Of course, you couldn't be careless, you still had to make sure you aimed well, but with this new head hit zone, it really did make Kirin much more manageable for all weapons. A point that's also worth noting is that since the Kushala video, I'm sure it does sound like we're going to be praising a monster for being easier and equating that to a better fight. And I'm sure it does kind of sound that way if you ignore everything else, and if you haven't seen the Rathalos video yet. Old generation Kirins were really tough though, and a bit of a wall for a lot of players. However, in World, it's still a very good fight for a majority because of how it allows the player to actually take part in Kirin's moveset. Kirin running away or Kushala locking out your access via impassable tornadoes does not equate to an engaging moveset. It equates to sitting around or playing catch up, hoping that you do get to participate in the fight at some point.
A fight where you have to let the monster come to you because there's little else you can do is not engaging. You may find it cool or ties into the lore or whatever, but it isn't an active experience. It's a passive observer's role that you're in, and for a game about going toe-to-toe with monsters and taking them down, it's certainly a very underwhelming experience. We want to feel satisfied and like we were a participant in the show these great designs are putting on, and not just buying popcorn and sitting in the cheap seats.
No, on topic of difficulty, World Kirin was deadly, and it's not a monster players could avoid. Tempered Kirin and Arc-Tempered Kirin could easily one-tap players with its lightning bolts, and even if you did survive those, your chances of getting paralyzed and stunned were also extremely high, so one misstep could spell disaster for you. And Base Game World had this problem where the endgame grind consisted of just grinding away the same Tempered Elder investigations for decorations, and Kirin was that wall.
At Hunter Rank 49, you were tasked with your first Tempered Elder, a Kirin, and defeating it would allow you access to the best Face Stone chances and Tier 3 Tempered quests, drastically reducing your Deco grind. Not only that, but the eventual Arc-Tempered monsters and even the Jagras Deco farm would be locked behind this wall, which meant every hunter needed to experience the Grand National once or twice.
Not only that, but Arc-Tempered Kirin also boasted some solid gear that most hunters were looking for free element needed, so again, it's not something you can just avoid really. So every hunter had to learn the Kirin matchup, or die trying. It was a shared community experience and one of those things that really did bring a lot of life and conversation within the community, good or bad. And this is really where one of the first world-centric divisions in the community arose. Before Alatreon, speedrunning conversations, or weird shit about Warvarian twins came into the picture, tempered and arc-tempered Kirin was the topic of a lot of complaints in World. Most hunters could not deal with the Lightning Horse and its power to completely obliterate hunters who failed to learn its moveset. The key to this lay in the way that Kirin countered new mechanics, and honestly, it's a very good curveball that Capcom could have thrown us at endgame.
You see, Kirin was one of the few monsters that really punished the mantles, a key part of the Monster Hunter World experience, and it wasn't alone either. Basilgeuse and Valhazark, along with our equine friend here, severely punished the Rocksteady mantle. The lack of knockback provided by the Fancy Poncho would allow multi-hit attacks to just insta-gib the hunter, and Kirin would combo you into the sun with stun and paralysis. Even if you managed to avoid these effects, there were still attacks that would drop multiple separate lightning bolts on the same spot, which was just the horse's way of saying, yeah, no Rocksteady for this one, chief.
The other mantle, known as Streamer Mantle, was also not the best fit for this fight, as if you got hit by the lightning attacks and it would force your evade, it would also take time away from your taunt windows and reduce the amount of openings you actually had. And of course, the Evasion Mantle, while amazing, still required the player to actually know where the lightnings would strike and be aware enough to actually avoid them properly. Before Lunastra showed up, Kirin was definitely the most hotly discussed monster. So with today's Kirin topic, we did want to reiterate that the redesigns can be great, like Rathalos, which was pretty stale up until Rise.
In the same vein, Kirin was also a pretty outdated encounter before World, and fights like these feel much better when refreshed and brought up to modern standards. The difference here between these monsters and something like Glavenus was that Glav was a new fight and already advanced. It really didn't need to be changed.
And while we would still prefer new monsters when we can get them, remastering old outdated fights are also a very welcome change, see Fatalis and Alatreon. And with that, I do hope to see some exciting changes for the crustaceans in Sunbreak, as they are also some very boring monsters that desperately need to get a facelift. But that's all we got for you today. Thank you all for watching, and thank you again, Sarah, for being the co-host as always, much appreciated. And good luck out there, hunters. See you guys in Elgato.